As Lorena mentioned, I'm Lauren Wingo, and I'm with Arup out of our Washington, D.C. office. And I'll follow up to Mike's presentation and really talk about SE 2050 and the nuts and bolts of that program. That's my one structural engineering joke for the day. Okay, so for those familiar with the Architecture 2030 challenge, Mike was mentioning Architecture 2030 previously. The SE 2050 challenge was really formed on the basis of that precedent, and the SE 2050 challenge was issued by Carbon Leadership Forum, the organization bringing us all together here today. Initially, the Carbon Leadership Forum actually incubated the idea of SE 2050, and in the summer of 2019, they issued the SE 2050 challenge, which is all structural engineers shall understand, reduce, and ultimately eliminate embodied carbon in their projects by 2050. In response, SEI, which is the parent organization to SE 2050, responded with unanimous support from the Board of Governors and adopted the SE 2050 challenge. That was in December 2019 and really kicked our group off with starting to develop the program formally. We launched at Greenbuild this past November of 2020. And as part of that, we had our website, se2050.org, go live. I'd recommend you all visit our website. I'm going to be mentioning it a lot throughout the presentation. So the impetus for SE 2050 came about with our group getting a lot of questions like those you see on the screen. And we still get a lot of these today, and perhaps some of you might have had similar questions to these in the past or even still do. A lot of questions from structural engineers that perhaps don't yet have the literacy about embodied carbon, or maybe are concerned about what the impacts could be to their projects in terms of, does this cost more to do? Is it going to affect schedule? And so we're really trying to respond to that and help bring the structural industry forward. But on the other side of the equation are architects, owners, other collaborators that are really excited about addressing embodied carbon and wanting to get going quickly. But if we compare that to structural firms that might just operate under their business as usual scenarios, that's not going to get us to net zero by 2050 quickly enough. And so SE 2050 really bridges that gap to help bring our structural industry forward. If we look at SE 2050 compared to AIA 2030, which came out of the Architecture 2030 challenge, AIA 2030 focuses on operational carbon, and Mike had some good figures previously, really putting into context the comparison of operating energy use versus embodied carbon. SE 2050 fills in the balance of getting to look at embodied carbon and setting embodied carbon targets as we get to net zero by 2050. And I think in addition to what Mike was saying about buildings getting more efficient, on the policy side, we're also seeing that AIA 2030 and its focus on operational energy, as well as green building programs that have traditionally focused on operating energy, that's now resulted in net zero operating energy legislation, including in jurisdictions like here in DC. We now have a net zero energy code. So SE 2050 is really looking forward at embodied carbon and what's next on the horizon there. When we came together a couple years ago and started formulating the concept behind SE 2050 alongside the CLF, these were the foundational principles to the program. And it was all about firms working on planning, implementing, and sharing. So what that means is that we really want firms to create a plan about how they're going to address embodied carbon, and then implement that on projects, actually put these strategies to use. And in Dirk's presentation next, he'll be speaking to a little bit of those strategies. And then, of course, sharing, a big part of our program is asking firms to share data with us, particularly GWP data, and also share with us feedback on successful strategies, how the program can improve and support the industry further. Because we really do see it as a two-way street between SE 2050 and structural engineering firms participating in the program. We do create an ask of the program in their commitment. I'll outline what that commitment exactly is later in the presentation. In return, we are providing a number of great resources to really help support the profession, as well as advocating on behalf of the profession. These are some of the resources that you'll see on our website, and I urge you to check it out. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback on the resources available from structural engineers as well as other design professionals. I also wanted to plug some of the publications on the right that come out of the Sustainability Committee. And there's one that was recently published within the past year called Achieving Net Zero Embodied Carbon in Structural Materials by 2050. It helps answer the question, how do we actually get to net zero by 2050? That is a question we get a lot. I would recommend you read that paper if you want to have that question answered. It outlines a number of different potential pathways on how structural engineers can get to zero by 2050 as a whole. One of the resources we have on the website is the embodied carbon intensity diagrams. We develop these for 3 different types of structural systems. So if you're a structural engineer that wants to quickly calculate the embodied carbon of your structural system, but you're not sure if your calculation is right and it might just be a crazy number, you can reference the results we have posted to our website to make sure that for your framing scheme that you're within the right ballpark. ECOM, this is the tool that we've gotten the most positive feedback on. It's a super simple tool for calculating your GWP. Dirk's going to get into that a little bit later. And then in the future, we are building a database. I'll also be mentioning that further on down the line. We expect that to launch this summer, and in the future, we'll be posting industry-wide benchmarks and targets to our website. So getting into the details of the program and what the commitment entails, particularly of interest if you're a structural firm considering signing up for the program, there are 3 primary requirements. The first one is once you join, you have to submit a commitment letter from your firm leadership to really demonstrate that you have firm-wide support and that this will be something that's deployed across the firm as a whole. Within 6 months and annually, you will develop an embodied carbon action plan. I'll outline the requirements of that. And then within a year and annually, we ask that you submit data to the SE 2050 database. The ECAP is really the cornerstone of our commitment program because it's what ties firms to participating in the program and helping us to improve as a profession. It comprises of education, reduction, advocacy, and reporting. And this is a document that's intended to be updated annually. That's to both hold firms accountable, but also have them reflect on what can be done better and keep working towards improved targets in order to get to zero by 2050. For the education component, the 3 key requirements are to designate a firm-wide champion, to develop a narrative of the plan, and then to attend Embodied Carbon 101 training. And that's to be deployed across the firm so that there's a level of embodied carbon literacy amongst all structural engineers, really bring up that education level. For the strategies portion of the ECAP, it's about setting a goal and to reflect and report on that progress. think about what strategies you could start implementing on your project and really discuss what worked, what didn't, what you could do differently next year. Keep working towards implementing more and more strategies as you get to net zero. Advocacy is a crucial part of the program. We're really looking to groups like CLF Vancouver for participation by our structural engineering firms. And it's also about sharing the commitment both externally and internally within your firm, as well as discussing it with clients, whether it's architect clients, building owners, anything of the like. The reporting requirements are all about submitting data to our database eventually. As part of that, firms have to develop a measuring methodology, figure out what workflows work for them. And then to start for the program, we have reporting minimums of 2 projects times the number of firm offices, but not more than 5 projects total for any given firm. And we worked really closely with our industry to establish these reporting minimums for the first year to make sure that there's a lot of program participation and to help encourage firms to get used to reporting. And then, of course, key aspect is submitting to the SC 2050 database. That's what I'll talk about next. So you may ask, why is SC 2050 developing a database? And I'll continue on Mike's description of LCA by explaining some of the gaps that we see in the industry currently and what we're trying to fill. The current approach for LCA is to perform a comparative LCA, and this is the approach taken by LEED, for example, where you have your proposed building and you're comparing it to a reference building. It's a great way to think through a strategy and really evaluate the performance of that strategy relative to a reference building and demonstrate improvement. But the limitation of that is that you're comparing between just a proposed building and a reference building. And we don't know how that project is performing overall relative to these industry targets as we're trying to get to net zero by 2050. It could very well be that your proposed building is performing better than the target, which would be great, or you could be performing worse. Or maybe your building was doing well in 2020, you do the same design in 2030, you're not really working on getting better. So as we look to the future, what I think a lot of us in the industry have been eager for a long time is a comparative LCA between your specific project and a centralized set of benchmarks. And that's where SC 2050, where we feel we can fill in. So how that works is that you perform your project LCA and report into a carbon database, which outputs benchmarks, and that creates a feedback loop where then projects can compare their performance against benchmarks. So there's already such a thing on the operating energy side in the US called CBEX. Fortunately for embodied carbon, we don't have the luxury of being able to stick an energy meter on the side of the building to measure embodied carbon. If someone invents that, that would be very useful. So we don't have anything like CBEX industry-wide currently. But SC 2050, we're going to work towards creating those benchmarks, and that will give structural firms the ability to compare their project performance, their proposed building designs against that industry-wide benchmark. As I mentioned, we're planning on releasing the database this summer. It will be a beta version. And we really set out these priorities whenever we were developing the beta database requirements. First and foremost, we really want to get structural firms just used to embodied carbon reporting and familiarize themselves with the process, really focus on developing their own workflows. At minimum, we want to make sure that we're collecting GWP results in order to develop those benchmarks. And as part of our process, really working to increase the visibility for the need of embodied carbon benchmarks and to make others aware of the lack of embodied carbon benchmark currently available. We do have some precedents to go off of if any of you have heard of some of these before, or if you haven't, just for your own interest of what's been done previously. RICS in the UK, they do have an embodied carbon database. What differentiates SC 2050 from the RICS database is that ours is done in conjunction with the commitment program. So we're tying firms through the commitment to reporting requirements, and they have to continuously report on an annual basis. RICS doesn't have that commitment aspect, so there isn't that continuous loop of new project data necessarily being submitted. deQo was a research project by Catherine DeWolf at MIT. Many of us participated in the very early phases. And this really was kind of a proof of concept about how a structural embodied carbon database could be developed. And through that, she was able to develop benchmarks for different building use types. Some of you that do work at structural firms may have your own version of an internal tracking, maybe just a simple spreadsheet that has your embodied carbon numbers for your various projects. This is actually a snapshot out of a database that I helped out on when I was an intern at Arup long ago. And I vividly remember looking at these results and seeing scatter and realizing how difficult it was to create benchmarks at the time due to the variability in LCA results. This is a wireframe showing what we intend to do for the beta database. We'll have the structural firms performing their LCA analysis and then reporting out the GWP results to a centralized SC 2050 database, along with some project descriptors so that we can make sure that when we're looking at the GWP results, we're comparing like for like. We're also hoping to implement the ability that the LCA tool could directly export into our database, because we really feel it's important to have alignment with the other tools available across the industry. And once we have sufficient aggregated data, we'll work with an industry roundtable to help us develop benchmarks and targets. And then that creates another feedback loop back to the structural firm so that they understand how their projects are performing. In terms of the whole LCA ecosystem, this is sort of where SC 2050 fits. This is a graphic I adapted from Kieran Timberlake, who develops Tally. And it looks at the design process and what tools can be used at each stage. The LCA tools like OneClick, Impact Estimator, Tally are really for the design development CD phase, where you have a more fleshed out design and you're interested in doing comparison of options. Early on, you could do simple hand calcs to figure out your embodied carbon, or use our ecom tool on the SC 2050 website. And SC 2050 would be the place where during design, you can reference a benchmark to understand how your design is performing. On the procurement side, there's the EC3 tool, which is great because once you get to that process and you're selecting between suppliers that have EPDs, you can choose the one with the lowest impact relative to the benchmarks that EC3 has set for that product category in the region. So I showed that scatter shot from the Arup internal tool that tracks embodied carbon. This is out of a CLF benchmarking effort. you see this over and over again in any benchmarking effort. There's a lot of data variability, and we want to help address that as well. So part of what we want to work on looking forward is improving LCA reporting, specifically focusing on how structural material quantities are classified, and making sure that when people are performing LCAs, they're doing it based off of the right material quantities and including the right materials within their scope of assessment. We also want to advocate for alignment of LCI data. It does become limiting if you have all these different tools with different backing data and you can't compare across the tools and the results that are coming from them. And I know CLF is really focusing on that advocacy as well. So in the future, some of the ideas we've thought of to help address that variability is the potential of structural firms reporting structural material quantities in a consistent manner to a centralized database hosted by SE 2050. And that would give us the ability to feed the structural material quantities to various LCA tools. So instead of getting results from just one tool for one project, you could ostensibly get results from multiple tools from one single project in a more easy and consistent manner. But if you are a structural engineer working with structural engineering looking at embodied carbon, there's no reason to stop you from starting to evaluate your performance now while we await the SE 2050 benchmarks to be released. There's a ton of tools, I mentioned them. There's also great, what I'm calling performance indicators that you can refer to. I mentioned the embodied carbon intensity diagrams that are available on our website. You could see generally how your project is performing relative to those numbers. There's a CLF benchmarking database. And then more recently, iStructE, they are our sister organization in the UK. They released this scores document, and you can actually give your project a score of embodied carbon performance. So I encourage you all to do some of that now. And I'm going to hand it over to Dirk, who's going to talk about his firm's implementation of embodied carbon strategies.